Hello, my name is Mike Alber. Thanks for coming to my symposium talk about my IIS project. So what I'm going to be talking about today is autumn flowering wing stems, seed set, floral display size, and flowering time as an indicator of climate change. So an important concept that I'm pretty sure you're probably familiar with, but may not know the word for, is phenology. Phenology is essentially just an organism's seasonal life history events in response to climate and the study of those events. The images I have here on this slide are good examples of phenology. You can see just the deciduous trees in the autumn change the color of their leaves and eventually lose them. Other examples of phenological events include when an animal may choose to hibernate, or when birds migrate to warmer climates, or what I'm most interested in, the flowering times of certain species. So what time of the year and what season plants choose to flower. So an interesting study that looked at flowering times used data from the 1850s collected from Thoreau's journals about Walden Pond and compared them to the same species in the same area, but collected in the early 2000s. This study found that flowering times had advanced significantly in the past 150 years. This study also found that advancement was strongly correlated to increase in temperatures due to climate change. So this kind of gives a link between climate change and altering phenologies. And these findings in spring phenology in particular and spring flowering times have been replicated in many other studies and is very well studied. However, autumn phenology, on the other hand, is not as well studied as spring. In fact, there are about a third to half as many studies in autumn phenology compared to spring. The studies that do exist, most of them tend to focus on the example I used in the first slide, which is deciduous trees changing their color in the autumn. And the studies that do look at what I'm interested in, which is flowering times, indicate that there's trends that seem to show advancements in flowering times and delays in flowering times. So what I was interested, to get a better insight into what's happening in autumn flowering times in response to climate change, I decided to look at my study species wingstem, also known as Verbicina ultimifolia. So this is an autumn flowering species in the Asteraceae. An important thing to note is that the wingstem reproduces hermaphroditically. This essentially means in the case of this flower that it goes through a male reproductive phase first, where it produces pollen, followed by a female reproductive phase where it receives the pollen and fertilizes its seeds. Here I am in Worcester Memorial Park. I was able to go to that park to study my species thanks to the Friends of Worcester Memorial Park. So here are some images of the flowering phases that I mentioned in the previous slide of wingstem. In the first image, you can see a flower just about to bud, or budding, about to enter male phase. An important thing to note about wingstem is, along with many other species in the Asteraceae, it's a composite flower, meaning each head is actually composed of many different flowers. In this case, they're called florets. So each little nodule you see on the end of this flower is actually its own little flower. So in the second image, you can see some of the budding flowers again, but also around the edges, you can see more of the male phase, which is the black with the yellow tip, and a couple of the female phase, which you can see much easier in the third image, which is the black with the yellow tip, but the tip, it has those wings, those little yellow wings. So that's when the flower is receiving pollen. And then finally, once it's received pollen and it's gone through all the flowering phases, it'll close back up and start to form the seed, which is what you can see in the last image. So this chart kind of diagrams the flowering process of the populations that I looked at out at Worcester Memorial Park. On the y-axis, you can see a proportion of heads in each flowering stage, and then the date on the x-axis. So when I started, about 30% of the flowers had already reached seed set. So it was already closed up to start creating the seeds. And by the time I was done, it had reached about 99% seed set. Another thing you can see in this chart is that when I started, it was about the same percentage immature, so they hadn't quite started flowering completely yet. But by the time I was done, there were no more immature flowers. So this just kind of diagrams the overall flowering process. You can kind of get an idea of when certain events take place. So in addition to collecting the flowering times, I also categorize these populations of wingstem into early flowering, peak flowering, or late flowering individuals. By doing that, I could compare their female reproductive fitness by collecting seed set and head number over different periods of time, hopefully allowing me to gain insight into whether early flowering or late flowering individuals were producing more seed and would likely lead to a change in flowering time over several generations. My results, however, showed that early peak and late flowering individuals showed no significant difference in seed set or head number. This indicated that my data did not support that wingstem was flowering earlier or later in response to climate change. I hope that my research has continued and to gather larger data sets and to be able to study trends in the flowering time of wingstem over more than one growing season. By studying more than one growing season, you can have a better understanding of shifts in the flowering time rather than just trying to make interpretations based off whether certain early or late flowering individuals had a higher fitness. So implications for autumn phenology and why I think this research is important is that invasive species, for one, are better at occupying the autumn niche than native species. And invasive species are also better trackers of climate change. The combination of those two things means there is a possibility that if climate change progresses and seasons shift more, that invasive species may gain a foothold, leading to disastrous consequences for native ecosystems. In addition, if flowering time and pollinator activity are shifting due to climate change, and they're not shifting together, there may be mismatches between the two. This would lead to plants that don't have adequate pollination and can't reproduce as much, and pollinators that don't have access to the same food resources, both of which could lead to, again, consequences for the native ecosystems. So that's a little rundown of my project, and thanks for watching.